I'm going to screen share right now. If I can get it to work. Why is it not popping up anymore? Fix it again. There we go. Sorry, can you see the screen? Alright. Alright, we're good to go then. Well, for the two people that showed up here, welcome to the VGDC Writing Department's 8th week workshop that was supposed to happen a week earlier, but Veterans Day happened. Today, this workshop will be covering environmental storytelling techniques. My space does not work. Okay, so you might be wondering yourself, what is environmental storytelling? Well, before we get to that, I am going to go ahead and initiate activity time. I know I said there was going to be no activity. I guess this isn't really an activity, but whatever. Hold on with me for a second. So, tell me what... I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you guys to tell me what impression this picture gives you of the people that live in this environment. So you can see there's a house and everything. What do you think about the people that live here? Very messy. And what do you think that says of their character?
Probably disorganized, careless.
Disorganized, careless? Does chat say anything? So yeah, based off this picture, you can kind of get an idea of like what kind of like people might live here and whatnot, right? So, that is actually the crux of environmental storytelling. Basically, environmental storytelling is the art of using the environment as a space to tell a story. Or using environmental storytelling, people will pick up meaning based off of objects that you put in the environment. It can be used to give subtle clues about the narrative as a whole. And it lets players piece together a little story themselves too. It might not be right. It might not even exist in your story. But if you let players do this, then they'll make them more engaged. And like it says here, it can be done unconsciously. People may not be looking for clues to like piece together a story, perhaps, but they'll notice things and they'll be like, "Oh, I see." I segmented this a bit weirdly, but like, why would you put environmental storytelling into a game? Why would you go through the effort, I should say, of trying to do environmental storytelling? Well, it helps avoid unnecessary text exposition and info dumps. Because players will notice that if you type egregiously large amounts of exposition, they'll notice this and they'll be like, what the heck? Why am I reading through all of this? And this is true for all entertainment mediums. It doesn't matter if it's a book, radio, movies. If people notice this huge amount of exposition, they'll get mad. So environmental storytelling helps kind of curb that a bit. Sometimes environmental storytelling just makes more sense in a story kind of way. There are some situations, like in a horror, like imagine a horror game, right? Typically, developers like putting these little notes here and there to help explain the story. But sometimes it really doesn't make sense, because especially if you have paper notes, because then it's like, well, there's this something really dangerous going on. Who has the time to write out all these little notes so that somebody can like find them later? Sometimes that just really doesn't make any sense. So using environmental storytelling can avoid that issue. And overall, players just don't have to read as much. It allows them to focus more on the gameplay and not about wanting to play the game. Yeah. And also, it can result in some really good aha moments. It'll reward players for paying attention to what's going on in the game. Let me just
Brian,
check.
how do
Yep.
we afford the band AHA?
There's a band called Aha.
They may take on me.
Oh yeah, that's right. Oh yeah, that would be pretty. That'd be pretty expensive. But that's why you got a bootleg Aha. But that will be in a different workshop. No, it won't. And it can help characterize characters. Like from the picture that I showed you before, you kind of get you got an impression from the people that live there, right? So, if you know that if a player knows that a character is living in some sort of environment, or at least frequents it, and they experience the environment themselves, then the player will have this sort of idea of like what the character's been through, or like what they're going through right now, and that can be very powerful. And also, games, you're probably gonna put a virtual space in your game. You might as well do something with it. It's probably gonna be disappointing to the player if it's just like a gray space, unless you're like prototyping or something. But anyway, where is environmental storytelling? It could be in the environment, of course. It can be in objects. It can even be in characters. Like if a character's looks changes throughout the game, then that would be environmental storytelling too. If there's a visual element to something that can be used to suggest something, it can be used for environmental storytelling. Although there are some like boundaries here and there that I won't get into. So here are some examples of environmental storytelling. So imagine this, right? Imagine this generic example here. You are a soldier. You're in like a war zone or something, right? And the game tells you to meet up at some location, so you can meet Bravo Squad or something. So like maybe at a house so you can get more teammates. So you go over, and bodies of soldiers are just lying around all over the place. Conclusion? They're dead. You don't get to hang out with Bravo Squad. They're dead. You can tell that they're dead because the people that are supposed to be there are on the ground dying and they're bleeding out. The second thing is it suggests that something killed them. Like they didn't just like go crazy or something, right? Something in there took out the entire squad, and it suggests that you're probably going to come across this something later on in the game. So it can be like a little bit. It can work as like suspense, right? Not only in the narrative sense, but also in the gameplay sense. Like, oh, there's gonna be this like boss thing. I'm gonna like face him, stuff like that. The second example I'm gonna be using is a game called Trombone Champ. I do own the game, and yes, I did S rank almost all the base songs in the game, but you can see through the screenshot that it's generally a pretty cheerful game, right? It's got all these bright colors, it's got the description, difficulty, stuff like that, and the difficulty chart in the bottom left is kind of silly because you got tiers, spunk, dudes. It's not a game that takes itself so seriously, right? And then you get to this part in the game, and it's this really dark, foreboding kind of place. Okay, something you'd probably see in a more fantasy-like location, right? So, immediately you can tell that this is probably something that has to do with the narrative, or like at least is very important. So you need to like look around places. So by using this method, you've basically already said, oh, pay attention to this area, and you haven't actually said anything. This is especially important if you want your players to just kind of look around or something and then find the narrative by themselves. By suggesting this, you're just basically saying it's a very organic way of leading players to like a certain kind of like plot, right? BioShock, and the third example is BioShock 2. It's not really like a major plot point, right? But this is basically the room of one of the little sisters that you can encounter. Basically, you're playing as like a big daddy in this game. I'm not gonna explain the entire plot to you, but you can see here that there's like a little height chart, it, like documenting how much they've grown over the years. They even have like a little like teddy bear down there, and they've marked that too. And while it may not serve a greater purpose to the narrative, it might not, like, even if it's not like, oh, this is super important, we need to know Eleanor's like height at 7 years, right? It's still a really nice detail to put in. It really humanizes the little sisters. It makes the player not think that they're just like gameplay elements that they need to like protect or something, but like actual like humans that have been raised in this environment, right? And a character example we're going to go through is God of War. On the left, you see Kratos in God of War 1, 2, 3, as well as Chains of Olympus, Ghost of Sparta, I think that's the game, and then Ascension. Basically, Kratos in Greece. And you can tell that he's a pretty young dude, but he's also very buff, right? You can tell that he has like from this blade and stuff, you can tell that he's kind of very aggressive, right? And then you see Kratos on the right. He's got like a different set of armor now. Instead of like the gold, like metal armor things on like his right arm, right? It's like it's exchanged more to like leather fur type. And you can see he has a different weapon now. So and he also has a beard. Here, right? So you can tell from the right that this dude has changed significantly. Not only is he older, he's also changed the equipment that he has. He's changed his fighting style somewhat. And overall, you can tell that there's a sense of progression within the character design. Like he's not a character that remained the same for like 30 plus years despite having to age at some point, right? I feel like I worded that wrong, but you get what I mean. And the fifth example I'll be showing is Ready or Not. And I cannot show this to any of you guys because of the nature of the game, a lot of it is surrounded by really dark stuff, right? But I do believe that the game is a really good example of how to use environmental storytelling to suggest stuff. I don't know.
Well, is this for the workshop?
Yeah.
Yep.
So I would suggest looking at Ready or Not, but do be warned, because it's a game about special police forces, you're going to see a lot of messed up stuff, especially in the newer maps that the game offers. So be careful when you're looking at environmental storytelling in that game.
I thought you were talking about the horror movie.
Oh, well, I haven't seen Ready or Not, but the game is very dark, but it's also very good with its environmental storytelling. There's like little details here and there that can really like haunt you. Is that the right term? I'll say this. So, environmental storytelling skeletons. It's a little bit of a meme. Here's an example from Fallout 4. Basically, it's a little meme where like you throw a skeleton in there or something, and like a random place. So like maybe on like a toilet, or maybe in this pose where two people are fighting when a nuke goes off, and while skeletons may not be a good way of showing environmental storytelling in your game, just remember that like objects here and there, you can use them to great effect. I think in Fallout 4, even with all the memes about skeletons dying on the toilet or something, you can still use it to great effect, but probably don't overuse them. Because if you overuse certain elements, like in Fallout 4, people are gonna notice and you're gonna crack some jokes about it, which you may or may not want. So I showed you all these examples of environmental storytelling. So how would we implement them? Well, first, it starts at planning. Annie, hopefully you aren't just like speed running the entire process, and then you're like, oh wait, I could use environmental storytelling, but I can't do the things I want because I didn't plan them out. So it starts at the planning stage when you're first like building up your narrative. You should have an idea of like you should have a little bit of an idea of like what you want. Have lots of communication with your team. They need to know what you want in order to make what you need. So like if you don't talk with your artists at all, and you expect them to put in the details that you want them to, then I don't know what to say, but it's not gonna work out. So you're gonna, especially since the artists are most likely gonna be the people that are like gonna help you put this stuff in, right? So talk with your team, let them know clearly what you need in this environment to tell the story. Iteration, you're not gonna get the first iteration of basically the first iteration of an environment is not going to be the final draft. Keep iterating on the environment and tweak it a little bit to see what comes up as the most effective. Of course, you should polish up the environment and remember to scope it properly. This is very important because environmental storytelling, like everything in the game, it takes time and it takes art, and oftentimes it can take audio too. So keep this in mind. If you overscope the entire thing and you demand a lot of things from your team, they may not be able to get everything done. So even with the benefits of environmental storytelling, you should still try and keep it to like a minimum, right? Like keep it concise. And it's also highly dependent on level design too. So if your environmental storytelling detail calls for something, it may not work at all because of the way the level's designed, and you're gonna have to work around that too. And some tidbits here and there about environmental storytelling. Even with all of that, we've only built the stage. The player has total control over what they do in it, as long as it's within the game's mechanics, right? So consider where the player has to go. For example, if there's a thing called a critical path, and basically, it's where the player has to go in order to reach their objective. And you should carefully consider this when deciding to implement environmental storytelling in your game. Place details where the player can see them. If you want your player to see a detail, make sure you put them in a place where they're most likely to see them. They won't always see it no matter what, but if you place it in like this little corner of the map where only completionists would like ever look at, they're probably not going to see it. And if it's a really important detail, that's not a good thing. So place details where players can see them. And generally assume that the player has read little to nothing about what they're doing or the context behind it. Some players are just really like skipping through stuff in order to just get to the gameplay, right? So if you want to implement environmental storytelling, then you're really going to have to assume that they probably skip through the entire thing. And that is why environmental storytelling is useful, because even if the players just skip through the entire narrative, they can't skip through the art that the game uses. Use proper prop placement, character positioning, etc., to get across information that they have missed. And sketching out a rough idea of what details you want may help out your team. You may not have to do this, but sketching it out is always going to be pretty useful. So a bonus tip. I know I said we had no activity, but in lieu of that, I'm going to give you a bonus tip. So earlier I mentioned exposition. Exposition is basically a story's way of explaining what is going on and why. It typically serves to explain backgrounds of certain things, like backgrounds of characters, the background of like a conflict, etc. It can also serve to explain the game systems and whatever else you think needs an explanation in the game in order for the player to get the best out of everything. So, why? So, if the game needs explanations about its systems and its characters, how can it turn sour? Well, sometimes it takes up way too much time. Have you ever played a game and you're going through it and you're like, holy shit, what is with all this text? I want to get to the game. If you're not careful with exposition, this can happen to your game. And if it takes up way too much time, people are going to get impatient. It can also really break immersion if you don't do it properly. There's like a whole thing about how exposition is bad, specifically because people have not done it properly. And it may end up frustrating your players because they want to get to the game. They don't want to sit through all this stuff. And also, it can, like environmental storytelling, it can result in a lot of work trying to get it put in. And then, like, imagine your poor programmer. They just like look through your script and they see this entire fucking group of text that you've written out in order to explain the game, and they're just like, "Oh my god, what is going on here?" So it can also frustrate your team a little bit trying to put in all the exposition that you've basically put in. But here's the thing: like all things, it varies a lot depending on the type of game. Some players are going to be some types of players are going to be a lot more forgiving of exposition dumps. Like action gamers, they're probably not going to like it so much. However, if you're writing for a visual novel, then because reading is the norm in those games, visual novel players are probably going to be a lot more forgiving when you have to put in some exposition. So, very carefully consider the type of game you're writing for if you are going to put in exposition. And here is a little slide from one of our former officers about how not to give exposition. The first point is about how exposition cliches. So, for example, phrases like "as you know." Oh, and as they give you an example here. "As you know, our mission here is to discover a habitable planet." The reason why this sucks is because a lot of times this really does not make sense. Usually in a narrative, when someone says "as you know," the character's already acquainted with the NPC giving exposition. Why does the NPC feel the need to constantly remind you about what you're doing if they should already know that you should be knowing what to do, even though you shouldn't be knowing? Shouldn't be knowing? No, I mean, you know what I mean. Basically, characters discussing things they have no reason to be discussing just for the audience's behalf is noticeable. It feels weird, and it feels inauthentic. Unless your player is tuned out, but don't assume that. Also, don't rely on cutscenes to tell a story. Some games are very notorious for cutscenes. Don't assume that people who play those games are going to be fine with your game. If you're making games for this club, it's typically not going to be in scope because people are going to be like. People are typically not going to have the time to animate an entire cutscene. But at any level, using cutscenes to explain the entire story is not going to be very good. Like it says here, players wanted to watch a movie, they would have watched the movie. Players want to participate in the story, not observe it. They don't want the entire game explained to them. They also want to figure things out on their own. They want to experience the game for themselves. And putting everything in cutscenes tends to really dampen the whole experience. Here it's like, for example, in Hunt Down the Freeman, almost everything is explained in a cutscene, which is very jarring, especially because a lot of people that are going to be playing the game are gonna be Half-Life players, where the games don't use cutscenes at all. So so basically, don't rely on cutscenes to tell the story. Incorporate other elements to help tell the story. Also, do not interrupt gameplay to explain something. This is something I'm sure a lot of you have experienced. I'm sure that it's been very frustrating. You ever just like gone down to like a level and then you're trying to do something, but then the game is just like, hey, did you know this? And you're like, I don't fucking care. I want to do my thing. So be conscious of where you have space for these things. Be conscious where players have the attention span for. And be conscious of the interest in the different kinds of mediums that your story is using to get the story across. And that's basically the end of the workshop. Like I said, there's no activity. I've said that like 2 or 3 times already. And I'm assuming, and I did this because this is week 8. You guys probably have a lot of things to do. But yeah, if you guys, that's basically the end of the workshop. If you guys have like particular examples of environmental storytelling that you would like to share, they can share it in the VGDC's writing channel. And that's basically it.
Elden Ring.
Yeah, Elden Ring.